This is Canada Reads American Style, featuring two friends who love Canada Reads and Canadian literature. Welcome our host Rebecca from Michigan and Tara from Ontario. Hi everyone, it is Rebecca, and today I am speaking with the award-winning author Marcello Di Cintio. He has written 6 books, including Pay No Heed to the Rockets, Palestine in the Present Tense, and Driven, The Secret Lives of Taxi Drivers. His latest title is Precarious, The Lives of Migrant Workers, which we'll be discussing today. He has also written for the Globe and Mail, the Walrus, the International New York Times, and Canadian Geographic, among others. He lives in Calgary. And Marcello, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
And as I said right before we got started here, I reminded Marcello that we chatted about Pay No Heed to the Rockets and also Driven. And I will include those dates in the show notes as well for those who have yet to hear those interviews. They were fabulous as well, and the books were amazing. I do
Oh,
want to
thank you.
say, at the very beginning here, Precarious was my first book of 2026 to read. And it was an important book to read for me, especially with what's going on in the US.
Mhm.
We do not treat our migrants, certainly, well, we treat them worse now, but we don't treat them any better. It's very parallel, probably. We just do it on a much larger scale, I'm sure. But just to start with our first question, can you tell us what prompted you to write about migrant workers in Canada?
You know, in a way, my grandfather did. My grandfather was a migrant worker before that was even a term. He came to Canada from Italy after fighting in World War II, and he left behind his wife and 3 young daughters, one of whom was my mother. Traveled across the ocean to Calgary, where he worked as a in greenhouses and on construction sites, just like migrant workers now do in Canada, and to earn money to send home to the family in Italy. And he never wanted to stay in Canada. He wanted to return. He thought maybe 2 years. But when he decided to come home, my grandmother, who was fierce and is still alive at 99 years old,
Wow.
said, "No, no, you're not coming back. We're coming to you." And she packed the girls onto the boat and came to Calgary. And when my grandfather passed away in 2020, I started thinking about kind of his life as a worker here, because he has his contemporaries, or the people, the contemporary versions of him, right? Canada
Hmm.
is filled with people who left their families across the ocean, travel great distances to earn money and send it back. The difference, though, is that when my grandfather came to Canada, he had a choice whether to stay or not. He was granted what was called landed immigrant status upon his arrival. So he never wanted to stay, but he could have, and then he ended up staying after all. But today's migrant workers, are here under different programs in which they are not allowed to stay. They are temporary foreign workers, is the term we use up here. So we're happy as a nation to take their labor, but we don't want them to stay. They can work, but they have to go home. And I was kind of interested in that sort of dichotomy, and the lives of these men and women who wanted the same things that my grandfather wanted, but are treated considerably differently in my country.
Wow. Yeah, that was really fascinating about your grandfather's story. And especially, like you said, he had the ability to become, to stay, but we don't do that now. So, sort of what changed between, then and now?
Well, see, it's funny. I'll answer that question, but leading to how I learned the answer to it is that, so I started off with this book. I was going to do it like I approached my book about taxi drivers. I thought the book would be, a series of profiles of workers, men and women from around the world and around Canada now. Why were they here? What kind of life did they leave behind to come to Canada to work? All these sorts of things. And in a way, the book is that, to a large extent.
Hmm.
But I learned pretty quickly that in order to understand their lives, the lives of these workers, I had to understand the programs under which they came here. And in order to understand those programs, I had to understand the history of those programs too. And so that led me all the way back. And to answer your question, what changed? You know, Migrants started being temporary when they stopped being white. when the demographics of immigration changed, in the 60s and in the 60s and 70s, when Canada stopped getting only Europeans like my grandfather and started bringing in people from Africa and South Asia and the Middle East and Latin America, then and the Caribbean, then the Canadian governments decided, whoa, 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 whoa. How about we still want them to work, but we don't want them to stay. And these programs are really based on the the ethnic and racial demographics of who started to come and when they started to come.
Yeah, and it reminds me of, a few years well, it could have been in his first administration. Trump made a comment about, immigrants coming, and he said, "Yeah, we want them from Norway or Sweden or something like that." And at the time,
Right.
that was the first time he had made really, I think, his most overtly racist comment, you know what I mean? And so you're right, we want the immigrants that look like some of us, but not all of us, right?
Yeah, it was really it was and it's this isn't my the funny thing is that this isn't my interpretation of those laws. This
Mhm.
was explicitly stated in documents. This idea that people from certain parts of the world are not suited for Canada. And that stuff was laid bare on policy documents. This isn't some kind of reflecting back from a more enlightened age. That's not it at all. This is how these were designed. These were designed to allow people of color to work but not to stay. And those programs are still intact. Those are still the same programs that migrant workers come to Canada today under. Now, I would suggest that they're not racially based now. However, they haven't changed from when they were. So what difference does it really make? You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
it had its roots in something ugly and dark, and it still exists.
Yeah. Now, you didn't pull any punches in describing the governmental bureaucracy, exploitation by employers who you sometimes named, which kind of surprised me, to be honest. And you were critical of sort of your average Canadians and their complicity. You used that term a number of times in the system. And I just wondered, were you concerned that you might put some readers on the defensive at a time when Canadian pride is probably at an all time high?
Yeah, yeah, yes, yes is my short answer to that question. Um, especially, I mean, this book took like 4 years to write.
Yeah.
And so we're getting near the end of the process when tariffs and 51st state and elbows up started happening in Canada, right? Like we were, as I say in the conclusion, I've written an unpatriotic book in a very patriotic time. And so, yeah, I was worried about that. I was worried. We're waving the flag pretty hard up here these days, and for someone like me who was born and raised in this country to come forth and say, "Hey, look, like we got a lot to say, we got a lot to address here. There are some sins in our history that we need to look a lot closer at." That's not a popular thing to talk about,
Hmm.
but I would argue on the other side, if we want to be the country we claim to be, if we want to believe our own hype that we're this benevolent nation, especially compared to the folks on the other side of the border, present company excluded.
Oh,
Um,
thanks.
then we should live up to that ideal. We should live up to that I would call it a myth or a stereotype. If we want to believe we're the kind of country that treats, people from elsewhere with kindness and generosity and hospitality and this kind of maple dipped sense of what it means to be in Canada, then we need to address when we don't do that. And I think the most patriotic thing a country can do is to look closely and unflinchingly at the sins of its past. I mean, Canada hates doing this. It's only been in the last few decades where we've started to address, our mistreatment of the indigenous people here. You know,
Yeah.
how many years overdue is that nonsense? Someday in the future, and I write about this in the book too, that a prime minister someday is going to stand up in Ottawa in the House of Commons and officially apologize on behalf of the government of Canada for the mistreatment of migrant workers over the decades. We wouldn't. I don't know when that's going to happen. It won't be soon, but we should fix things before we need to apologize further for them.
Yeah, and here, I think Canada has done a pretty good job of trying to acknowledge and apologize at different times. I know it's been a long time coming, but I've seen some movement there. And we don't do that here in the US. You know, we really just double down, and especially now it's really bad, and they're kind of rewriting the history, et cetera, and removing anything to do with people of color, migrant workers, et cetera. We've vilified them here. So it's really and the thing that scares me the most is as much pride as there is in Canada right now, you still have that thread that runs through your country of people who believe what is going on down here is the right way to handle things. So we know, you know, you had the big convoy thing. I mean, there is that thread as well, and so it worries me that you know we're kind of going well. We're dragging the world down. I think is kind of where I'm at right now. So
You
yeah.
know, I live in Alberta, where there's a rising separatist movement, and I'm working on a story about this group now too,
Ooh.
and a lot of what they say, what they want Alberta to be, they don't. They've stopped saying we want to be part of the United States. I mean, some of them have. I was at a rally 2 days ago where there were people wearing American flags,
Oh.
um, but what they want is America light. You know, they want a free Alberta to have the same gun laws that America has. They want to elect Supreme Court justices like you do. They want to elect a president like you do. You know, it's this policy document that this aspiration that the separatists have in my part of Canada is to be as much to be as close to the United States as possible. And I guarantee you, of the thousands of people that were in that rally that went to the other day, the majority of them are would be a-okay with the kind of deportations we see going on in the United States. You know,
Yeah.
and it's yes. So that the darkness certainly drifts north, especially in my part of the country.
Now, that article that you're writing, where will you be publishing that? Do you know yet, or is that already decided?
Yeah, I'll be publishing in a Canadian Geographic in the spring.
Okay. Okay, good, because I'm gonna look for that because I really I would really wanna read that, so oh, the other thing I just wanted to mention really quickly too was when I talked about government bureaucracy and the employers, I think
Mhm.
you laid that out so well. I mean, I just felt like if I needed to know sort of the history of this from beginning to current times, I feel like you nailed it completely. So I'm sure there's tons of other things that you had to leave out. Otherwise, the book probably would have been 1,000 pages. But you did a really good job of trying to lay out that argument about the bureaucracy and the employers. So how did you how did you know where to stop with
It's a good
more
question.
detail, I guess? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, uh, I had to learn a lot of policy, and a lot of policy that goes back decades. Policy that changes. It seemed like every few months something new would happen, and I'd have to rewrite chapters. And so my kind of challenge was, or my approach to it was, if I have to deal with all this material, my reader doesn't need it all. So I need to put it all down on a first draft and then cut away all the stuff that the reader doesn't need to know. You know what I mean? Like
Oh,
I didn't
yeah.
want to make an academic book. So I'm like, so I had to kind of give it the kind of the bare bones so that the reader understands what's going on. I mean, otherwise you're buried in acronyms that continuously change and
Mhm.
government departments that continually change. I mean, it was, I went through that for so you don't have to,
Yeah.
as a reader. And that was one of the big challenges of the book for sure, was kind of translating policy into English. And yeah, that was a big part of writing of the book.
And then with regard to the, employers, how
Mhm.
difficult was it to get the employers to speak to you?
Well, you know what? I didn't reach out to a lot of employers.
Mhm.
I really wanted it to be the lives of migrant. It's the subtitle, "The Lives of Migrant Workers." I really wanted to see the situation from the workers' point of view. I didn't, certainly a employer who was, treated his workers badly were not going to talk to me. People who treated their workers well, that's not part. It's kind of not part of the story. I did speak to one farmer who hires a lot of migrant workers in Ontario, And he seems like a great boss. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But the point of this though is that, and this is what I kept hearing over and over again by kind of defenders of the programs. They would say things like, "Oh yes, there's some abuse and some exploitation and mistreatment, but that's just a few bad apples."
Mm-hmm.
And that's such an easy way to dismiss the whole thing. Yeah, we've all had a bad boss, but and that's true. And yes, and are all bosses are all employers of migrant workers in Canada terrible? Of course not. But the point is, they can be. The way the system is designed is that bad bosses get away with being bad. And that's not a bad apple problem. That's a bad orchard problem. That's down to the root of what's going on here. And
Yeah.
so it's very easily for you to dismiss the problems as the problem of one or two, individuals. But that's not the case at all. The case is that the whole structure, the whole bureaucracy that the government designed is designed to make it easy for employers to be be bad and to abuse workers. The penalties are low and rarely meted out. And the fact of the matter is too that these programs weren't designed to treat workers well. You know what I mean? These programs are not charities. It's
Yeah.
not like if you look at their policy documents, it says something like, "Oh, we've developed this migrant labor system to allow, you know, someone from the Philippines to pay for their mother's medical bills, or it's for someone from Mexico to buy their parents a new house or put their kids through school or to give them a better life." That's not what it's about. It's not this benevolence. These programs are designed exclusively to provide labor to employers in Canada. End of list. And so there's yes, there are rules the people need to follow, but that's the intention of the programs is not to benefit workers, it's to benefit employers. And that's the seed of the whole thing is right there.
Well, it's interesting because my first experience, now these, well, let me say this first. Let me go back for a second here. I was fascinated by the people who ended up becoming undocumented
Mhm.
migrant workers, even though they came in through the proper channels, they tried to do the right thing, and then they end up undocumented. So, do you think that's a large that's probably a small percentage of the migrant workers in Canada maybe, or is it a larger percentage than I think? Do you know?
Well, it's probably small, and it's small.
Mhm.
And I'm glad before I answer that, I'm glad you brought that up. And I just want to say too, you know, we've been talking so far about structures and policies. This book is really about the people who are doing the work, the workers themselves. And
Mhm.
so, if the challenge of the book was translating policy to English, the joy of the book was getting to meet these workers from all around the world and hearing their stories and having them sit with me and talking to me about what they've been through, and often their bravery and their resilience and their badassedness, of how they kind of fought against mistreatment and exploitation. Like some of the people in this book are heroic.
Mhm.
And many of them are these undocumented workers that you mentioned. But yeah, like how many workers are undocumented in Canada? I mean, it's obviously for obvious reasons, counting undocumented people is difficult.
Sure.
In Canada, for the most part, our undocumented population are not people who kind of surreptitiously cross the border. They're almost all people who overstayed visas or who arrived here legally in some capacity and are now have lost status. And that's the majority of workers here, of undocumented people here. The
Yeah.
undocumented workers I spoke to mostly were those who came in under legit temporary foreign worker programs and either left those jobs or were kicked out of those jobs for one reason or another and had decided to stay and work undocumented. Now, if you think that migrant workers under the systems that are here legally face exploitation and abuse, imagine if you're here, in the shadows. The undocumented workers I spoke to are incredibly vulnerable to all manner of abuse and mistreatment, from financial to physical to sexual assault, and they're afraid to speak up because they're not supposed to be here, right?
Right.
And so their stories were for certain the most harrowing.
Yeah, I want to agree with you because the stories of the people themselves, when you got down to the telling those stories, because I did actually find the policy stuff fascinating because as I told you before, every time I'd think like, "Oh, this is gonna finally work. People are gonna benefit from this, workers are gonna benefit from this." Then all of a sudden the policy would change and you just go, "Oh, God bless," we're back down to square one again. So I did actually enjoy the policy stuff, but it's the people. When you told the stories about the individual workers, and I agree, talk about some badasses. There were some people that just you just won't forget them. They're just amazing. But I just want to mention one thing really quick because I did the first time when I moved to Los Angeles, I lived in Los Angeles. So I was there in the mid 80s. And that was the first time I had encountered, for us, undocumented workers, right? And I worked in bars and restaurants. And I came from Flint, Michigan, union, big union town and everything. And I remember seeing these guys that I worked with horribly, their labor was horribly exploited. And I remember saying to them very naively, "You should say something. You should speak up and say something." And of course, they were horrified
Yeah.
and they were like, "No, no, don't say anything." Well, that was my first, I didn't even realize that they were undocumented. And that's what this was all about, right? So here's the thing that surprised me about your book, though, because I kind of felt like I had a slight idea of sort of, migrant workers, that whole thing. I sort of thought I knew a little bit, but here are the two things that stood out for me in your book that I really found fascinating. One, and I want you to, if you can talk about it a little bit, is the idea of Filipino workers that have to send money back to the Philippines. Like that was a shock to me. And I don't know if other countries do that or if in your example, Philippines was just the most sort of egregious one. I don't know. And then the second thing that you kind of touched on earlier, and that is I just assume, and maybe it's the same in the US in this way, that just because they come here to work doesn't necessarily mean they want a pathway to citizenship. Maybe they just want to come
Right.
here and work. And I thought that was
Yeah.
really fascinating because in the US we always feel like, "Oh my gosh, they're coming here, they're taking our jobs, etc." And sometimes it's like, "No, they just want to work and then go home." So
Yeah.
I just thought those
That's
two things were
my
fascinating.
grandfather.
Yeah.
Yeah, my grandfather didn't want to stay. Yeah,
Yeah.
that is part of the it sounds like the American ideal too, and certainly the Canadian one, where we are the greatest country in the world. Why wouldn't you want to stay?
Right.
Wherever else you came from, where the Philippines, Mexico, the Caribbean, those are places are rough. You should be grateful uh, to be here. And so many of the so many of the workers that I met, they're like, no, that we didn't come to stay.
Mhm.
There's a they don't see Canada as this golden palace, right? As this dreamscape. I mean,
Mhm.
a lot want to stay. There are opportunities in Canada that don't exist in the Philippines, for example. Um,
Mhm.
but that doesn't mean that this is that it's heaven up here. I remember talking to this one Filipino woman. I write about her in the book, and at one point she came as a migrant worker, got her permanent residency, and is now here for good, right? Which is
Mhm.
what she always wanted to do. But she talked about Canadians, and a lot of the Filipinos work in caregiving, and not just in America, but around the whole world, or in Canada and everywhere. So she was talking about how Canadians are not family oriented, was her terms, because we're so willing to allow a migrant worker to take care of our elderly or to take care of our children, whereas in the Philippines they would never do that.
Mhm.
Fair enough. I mean, when I talk about my grandfather, he died in a hospice. My grandmother is currently in a memory care facility being taken care of by Filipinas. She had a point for sure, even though that kind of stung a little bit. It was true. But later in our conversation, she said to me that she never, even though she's Canadian now, she doesn't feel Canadian. And when she first said that to me, I thought she meant that we haven't treated her with welcome, right?
Mhm.
She'd been treated, with maybe discrimination or some sort of lack of hospitality. But as I was thinking about it later, I go, I don't know if that's what she meant. When she says that she doesn't feel like she's Canadian, I don't think that was a complaint. I think that was a boast. I think she was saying, you know, I'm not Canadian because a Canadian's the kind of person who warehouses their elderly. And we
Exactly.
would never do that. You know what I mean? Like, so, you
Yeah.
know, her saying she's not Canadian was not bemoaning the fact. I think she was she thought that she was better than Canadians are, and in that sense, it's hard to argue.
Yeah. So, okay, can you just just mention that about the Philippines, how they send money
Oh
back
yeah,
though? Because that
pardon me.
was a
Sorry.
surprise to me. Yeah, yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's okay.
Yeah. I mean, one of the greatest kind of migrant worker, supplying countries, if I can put it that way, is the Philippines, and they have been for decades. It, kind of the remittances that workers send back to the Philippines is an extremely vital part of their kind of GDP, part of their national finances. And so it is the rule that if you go working abroad, like many, many, many Filipinos do, you must send money home through a Filipino bank. You can't just wire it back. It has to end up in the country's coffers at some point.
Yeah.
Failing to do this, you lose. They'll take away your ability to travel. You know what I mean? It's such an important part of the economy that they can't risk you sending your money directly to your mom and dad and not through a government run bank.
Wow. That was a shock to me. When I read that, I that kind of blew my mind. So now I'm curious. Now, was there anything you discovered in your research and or interviews that was shocking or something you hadn't known before?
Like what got me the most is the stuff I said at the very beginning was how these systems in their origins come from a place are very race based. Like I said before, the migrants stopped being permanent when they started being temporary when they stopped being white,
Yeah.
and how blatant that was surprising to me too. But another thing is kind of the most basic part of these programs is kind of the sins of the employer specific permit, the closed work permit. So
Mhm.
almost all the workers who come to Canada work under these closed permits, which mean that they can only work for the employer that brought them in. So if they quit or are fired, legally they're supposed to go home. And so, and if they're forced to go home, they lose the opportunities that Canada provided. They lose all these things that they came here to gain. And because of that one rule, which has been around since the very beginning of these programs, workers will endure all manner of abuse and mistreatment because they don't want to be sent home. They don't want to go home.
Yeah.
And that closed permit is a weapon that bad bosses use to be bad, right? Their workers are essentially shackled to these bosses. If we opened up those permits and allowed workers to leave terrible jobs and work elsewhere, if we offered them the level of freedom that we all have,
Yeah.
every Canadian can quit a lousy job and try to find another one. Migrant workers are not allowed to do this. If we offer them the same freedoms that we enjoy, the problems and the abuses and the exploitation would fall off. But having workers shackled to an employer, what employer wouldn't love that? That is a very this is why workers are brought in a lot of cases is because of this is indentured. If they can't go, it's captive in a way.
Yeah.
And there's something cruel and forgive me, un-Canadian about that whole idea.
Yeah, I agree because I wonder, I'm gonna have to look it up and see what it is in the United States because I don't know that well, I think we have a lot more undocumented workers, people who just come here and they get paid. Because I always said if they wanted to stop undocumented workers, all you have to do is find the employers. Because the employers are the ones who knowingly hire them. I mean, here in the United States anyway. I don't know what we do if we have a system like that. But that's the other thing about the abuse that
I think
people
you
are.
do.
Oh, we
I think
do?
there is a
Do
closed
we?
permit. Sorry, I
Oh, no.
believe that America does a closed permit system as well. But again,
Wow.
that wasn't the focus of my research, but
Sure.
I'm pretty sure that's in addition to the undocumented workers, which is the same as in
Yeah.
Canada, right? We have both communities up there.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, because reading about this and thinking about what's going on in the US and reading this about Canada and the laws and the abuse, which was really awful. again, great stories about the individual people that I loved. Those people were amazing, but there's still so much abuse. I wondered, do you think any country will ever get it right, or are migrants just doomed to being exploited and abused? Because I just feel like Canada kept trying to get it right, and then the laws would keep changing, and their people are basically stuck in the same process.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, certainly in my research, I didn't come up with any countries that are doing it right, like in general.
Yeah,
There are
yeah,
countries that have more open permits for certain industries, that than Canada does. But again, there's no place that hires migrant labor where we don't see problems. I mean, there are places that are worse.
yeah.
It's like in the Gulf countries where how many
Yeah.
migrant laborers died building the
Yep,
stadiums for the World Cup.
yep,
Like it's a remarkable, incredible kind of atrocity that that goes on there. The thing is, if you're a migrant worker, you are vulnerable. You are precarious, as the title of my book suggests. And around the world, there will be people that will take advantage of that vulnerability and that precarity. And I don't
yeah,
see that changing.
yeah,
If people are gonna, and there's people leave for reasons. People leave because opportunity is bad. People leave because they can't afford to pay for their their child's medical care. They leave for reasons. They're not adventurers. And so as long as there's those economic pressures to leave and to work elsewhere, and as long as there are places like Canada and the United States and the Gulf and everywhere else who offer those opportunities, workers will take a chance on it. They'll gamble. And I'll
yeah,
tell you this too, and part of me doesn't even want to say this, but almost all of the workers I talked to who told harrowing stories of abuse and exploitation also said that it was worth coming in the end.
yeah, yeah,
A couple didn't. I think of a woman from India who came very close to ending her own life several times, you
yeah,
know, due to the abuse and stress that she suffered here. But a lot of them, they feel that it was worth it.
yeah,
And and I hate saying that because that almost excuses the abuser,
mhm,
but it shouldn't, right? Like just because at the end of the gauntlet people feel grateful doesn't mean we should have put them through the gauntlet. That
yeah.
doesn't, their feeling at the end of the line doesn't justify everything that came before it. Ends don't justify the means. And so I guess that in a way answers your question. As long as there are people who are looking for opportunities and are willing to gamble on mistreatment,
Yeah.
then there will always then people will there's no shortage of people who will mistreat them.
Okay, so you talk about the complicity, because I have to say, when you wrote that statement, I felt that to my bones here in the US as well. And I said to my friends after I read it, I said, "We're all complicit. Americans are complicit, Canadians, everybody." But what do we do about that complicity? Because how do we I guess I don't know. How do we do something? Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah, that's a
how
good
do yeah,
question.
what can we do?
There's no easy answer for that question. I mean,
Yeah.
we can shop better. It's after spending these years on this book, I go to the produce section of my supermarket and I recognize the
Mhm.
greenhouses and farms where I've heard all manner of abuse, and I try not to buy those tomatoes.
Mhm.
Um, I think we can, as much as we can, pressure governments to change policy. I think we need to give voice to these workers themselves and make them feel safe to speak out. It's one thing for a guy like me to talk about this stuff. It's certainly better for workers to speak out for themselves and give them the space and the safety to do so. Like I said, yeah, these men and women who stood up for themselves, they changed laws, right?
Yeah.
I talk about a woman named Evangeline from
Mhm.
Edmonton who was undocumented, and she gave birth to a child in Edmonton who wasn't offered medical care, even though she was a Canadian citizen, just because her mother was undocumented. So Evangeline didn't, came out of the shadows. She was
Mhm.
here in Canada illegally, came out of the shadows, stood in front of the cameras, and demanded the laws change so she can give her daughter, whose name is McKenna Rose, the same medical treatment that every other Canadian-born person gets, at great personal risk for
Yeah.
deportation and even imprisonment. And she won. It
Yeah.
changed the law. The McKenna Rose law is on the books, thanks to Evangeline's bravery. And Evangeline eventually became a permanent resident, and now she's in Canada, safely and securely. And she hasn't sat down. She continues to stand up for other workers, other undocumented people, other Filipinas who are suffering mistreatment. And so what can we do? We can support people like Evangeline,
Hmm.
and give them space and platforms as much as we can, to speak out.
Well, it's funny because after I read your book, I looked up in my own community, like, are there ways that I could contribute? And there are. So I'm going to
Of
start
course. Yeah.
volunteering in some fashion with the organization that's literally local to my Flint area in Michigan. So yeah, thank you for that, because when you said we're all complicit, we all know it, because like I said, we all eat the fruits and vegetables and have caregivers or whatever. We're all somehow connected to these migrant workers, and we can't just turn a blind eye to it.
Yeah, I mean, their mistreatment subsidizes the prices of almost everything we
Yep.
have here in Canada.
Yep.
You know,
Same
those
here.
those strawberries would not cost that much if we had if it wasn't for migrant laborers who are willing to work for low wages and poor conditions. I mean, that's
Yeah.
just the way. That's the sad, dark fact of it.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I just want to say to everyone listening, please pick up a copy of Precarious. It is really worth reading. You will learn so much, whether you're in the U.S. or in Canada or anywhere else in the world. We're all part of this system of migrant labor, that's really important to know and understand. So, I do want to ask one last question, though, Marcello, because this is your third book that I've read, that I've loved all three of them so much, and now I want to know, even though you just published this one, are you currently working on? I know I hate to ask an author this after they're just now, published something and everything. But anyway, are you currently working on a new book that I can look forward to?
It's so funny that every interviewer always apologizes to the writer when they ask that question.
Yeah.
And they always ask it anyway.
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
never had a problem with that question.
Okay, good.
I think interviewers get more nervous about that question than the actual writer does.
Yeah.
This book took me 4 years to write. I would like to take a break from books for a little while. So
Mhm.
I'm working on a bunch of magazine work. I mentioned one story a little while ago there. And when I'm working on a book, all I want to do is write for magazines. And when I'm writing for magazines, all I want to do is find another book. So it could be a matter of months before I come up with something else. But right now, I'm enjoying writing, about some lighter things than this book too. Although Alberta separation is not that light of a topic.
Yeah.
I'm also writing a book about the September 11th 25th anniversary, also not a light topic. But I'm writing about
Wow.
indie, like a bunch of art school students in Calgary who started an indie pro wrestling league. And
Oh, wow.
I'm writing about my time in Mexico City, eating some amazing food. And so there's a bunch of much lighter things that I want to get to, but I'm sure I'll get back into the dark before long.
Okay, great.
The
Well,
dark
when
time.
well, I will keep an eye out for the magazine articles. Hopefully, I can access those here in
Yes,
Michigan and everything.
absolutely you
So,
can.
yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for coming back for the third time. And I look forward to your fourth trip back.
Oh, me too. Such a pleasure. I'm so happy to keep coming back.
Great. Thanks. Happy reading, everybody.
Thank you for joining us on our bookish journey. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing Canada Reads American Style wherever you listen. You can connect with the podcast and Rebecca on Instagram at Canada Reads American Style, and with Tara at On a Branch Reads. Until next time, keep reading.